It looked like a city alive with promise, but in the fog of Whitechapel, something was waiting. A killer no one ever caught, a shadow the world still fears, Jack the Ripper. London, 1888. The fog rolls heavy over Whitechapel. Gas lamps burn weak against the night. The streets are crowded yet silent. Narrow alleys, cobblestone roads, slick with rain. Every shadow feels alive. Every footstep echoes with unease. This was the heart of London's East End, a place of poverty and despair, where the unwanted lived and the forgotten died. And it was here that a name was born, a name that traveled far beyond these streets, a name whispered in terror, printed in headlines, etched into history: Jack the Ripper. Who was he? A surgeon with cold precision? A madman driven by rage? Or a ghost that London never caught? The story begins here, in the fog. Whitechapel, a district at the edge of London. By day it was crowded, by night it was chaos. Thousands crammed into narrow rooms, families of 6, sometimes 8 sharing a single bed. The air was thick with smoke, and the stench of rot never left the alleys. Alcohol flowed in every tavern. Desperation filled the streets. For many women, survival meant selling their bodies for a few coins. For men, it meant drinking until the cold night was forgotten. Crime was everywhere. Pickpockets, gangs, violent drunks, and above them all, the threat of something darker. The police were few. Patrols stretched thin. They carried only wooden truncheons and lanterns that could barely pierce the fog. Against organized crime and against what was coming, they were powerless. Whitechapel was a maze of shadows, and in that maze, a phantom would soon appear. For a killer, there could be no better hunting ground. August 31st, 1888. Her name was Nichols, 43 years old. Poor, homeless, one of many women walking the streets of Whitechapel that night. At dawn, her body was found on Bucks Row. Her throat had been cut, once, then again. Deep, clean, precise, and it did not end there. Her abdomen had been slashed open, organs exposed. The violence was cold, deliberate, and terrifying. The police arrived quickly, but there were no witnesses, no sound of struggle, nothing but silence, and the horror left behind. The newspapers rushed to print the story. A woman, butchered in the shadows of East London. The public whispered that a monster was loose, and they were right, because Nichols was only the beginning, the first victim, in a storm of blood that was still to come. September 8th, 1888. Only a week after the first murder, the Ripper struck again. Her name was Chapman. She was found in a backyard off Hanbury Street. Her throat was cut, her body mutilated, and this time, part of her organs were removed. The precision shocked investigators. It was no longer just murder, it looked like dissection. 3 weeks later, London awoke to its darkest night yet, September 30th, 1888, the date that would be remembered as the double event. The first victim that night was Elizabeth Stride. She was discovered in a dark yard, her throat deeply cut. But unlike the others, there was no mutilation. Some believed the killer had been interrupted. 45 minutes later, another woman was found, Catherine Eddowes. This time, the Ripper finished his work. Her face slashed, her abdomen opened, her kidney cut out and taken away. 2 women dead within an hour. London was drowning in terror. And then, silence. For weeks, the city held its breath. The fear was everywhere. Every shadow, every sound in the fog felt like the Ripper returning. On November 9th, he did, the final and most brutal killing. Mary Jane Kelly. She was found in her small room on Miller's Court. Her body was almost unrecognizable. The mutilation was so severe, the crime scene photographs were considered too horrific to publish for decades. The message was clear. The Ripper's violence was escalating, each murder more savage than the last. And London knew he was still out there. In the midst of terror, letters began to arrive. Sent to police, sent to newspapers, all written in red ink. The first was signed, "Dear Boss." In it, the writer mocked the police, describing the murders in chilling detail. And for the very first time, the world saw a name: Jack the Ripper. Soon after came the most infamous letter of all. It began with 2 words: from hell. Inside the package was half of a human kidney, preserved in alcohol, the same organ that had been cut from Catherine Eddowes. The press printed the letters. Headlines screamed, and fear spread even faster than the killings themselves. But were these words truly written by the killer, or the cruel invention of a journalist desperate to sell papers? To this day, no one knows. What is certain is that the name Jack the Ripper would never be forgotten. The press became the beating heart of the Ripper's legend. Every morning, fresh headlines screamed across London. The Star, the Illustrated Police News, each competed to outdo the other with sensational stories and lurid sketches. Woodcut drawings showed bloodied alleys, women's faces twisted in terror, and the shadow of a faceless man in a top hat. People crowded around newsstands before dawn, fighting to buy the latest issue. In taverns, strangers whispered over cheap gin, retelling every line of the papers. Some rushed to the crime scenes themselves, elbowing past police cordons, desperate to see the blood on the cobblestones. The city was not only haunted by a killer, it was intoxicated by the story of him. But the truth was as foggy as Whitechapel itself. Some believed the Ripper had written letters, mocking police, laughing at the panic he caused. Others believed it was the journalists themselves, forgeries dipped in red ink, designed to keep fear alive, and papers selling by the thousands. Facts mixed with rumor. Rumor hardened into certainty, and certainty turned back into fear. By the end of 1888, the murders had claimed 5 lives. But in print, Jack the Ripper had already become immortal. A monster created not only by the knife, but by the ink that spread his name through every household in London. Scotland Yard threw everything it had at the case. The best detectives in London walked the streets of Whitechapel. They questioned landlords, dock workers, butchers, doctors. Hundreds of suspects were taken in, but every lead collapsed. Every clue turned to nothing. The Ripper seemed to vanish into the fog after each attack. No footprints, no weapon, not a single witness who could swear they saw him. It was as if London was being haunted by a ghost. The newspapers turned on the police. Headlines mocked their failure. Citizens jeered at officers in the street, and the people of Whitechapel lost what little faith they had in the law. Rumors spread faster than the truth, that the killer was a surgeon, that he was a foreigner, that he was one of the city's own. But no matter how many doors were broken down, no matter how many men were dragged into cells, the Ripper remained free. And with each night of silence, London waited in dread, knowing he could strike again. Who was Jack the Ripper? The question haunted London then, and it haunts us still. Some believed he was a surgeon. The cuts, the removal of organs, the cold precision, all pointed to medical skill. A man who knew anatomy and used that knowledge for horror. Others whispered of scandal in the royal family, that a prince had wandered the streets in disguise, hiding shame with blood. The story spread quickly, but evidence was never found. Still others said he was nothing more than a lunatic, a nameless madman, lost in the alleys of Whitechapel, striking at random, then disappearing back into the fog. Dozens of suspects were named. Doctors, butchers, foreigners, local men. Each theory had its believers. None could be proven. And so the Ripper remained faceless, a shadow, an idea more than a man, a mystery that refused to be solved. From the fog of suspicion, names emerged. Dozens of men were whispered about, but only a few would echo through history. Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher. Weeks after the last murder, his body was pulled from the Thames. Some police believed his death marked the end of the killings, but there was no evidence, only a corpse and speculation. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant living in Whitechapel, known for unstable behavior, sometimes raving in the streets, eating scraps of food from gutters. committed to an asylum. His name appeared in police notes as a strong suspect, but no charge was ever filed. He lived quietly for decades, a man many believed was the Ripper, yet never proven. George Chapman, once a barber, later a convicted poisoner. He murdered 3 of his wives, slowly, with arsenic. Hanged for his crimes in 1903. Some detectives were convinced he had once killed with the knife, before turning to poison. But again, no proof. And there were others. Francis Tumblety, an eccentric American doctor who collected human organs in jars and fled London under suspicion. James Maybrick, a wealthy cotton merchant. His alleged diary claimed to be the words of Jack himself, but its authenticity remains debated to this day. Each name rose like smoke and faded just as quickly. Every time the public thought the Ripper had been unmasked, the fog closed in again. The killer slipped back into shadows, leaving London to wonder, were they hunting a man at all, or only a phantom, stitched together from fear, rumor, and the hunger of the press? Jack the Ripper did not vanish with the fog. He became something larger, a legend in the history of crime. His name filled books and newspapers for over a century. His shadow crept into films, plays, even comic books. Every generation retold his story, and every retelling added to the myth. Whitechapel turned into a place of dark tourism. Streets once feared became stops on guided tours, where people walked the same alleys, imagining the footsteps of a killer never caught. More than a man, he became a symbol of fear, of mystery, of evil that wears no face. And even now, his ghost still lingers in our culture, refusing to die. More than 130 years have passed, yet the mystery of Jack the Ripper endures. A killer never caught, a shadow never named. His story still walks with us, in every book, every film, every whisper on a midnight tour through Whitechapel's narrow lanes. The women he killed were forgotten in life, but remembered in death. Their names etched into history beside the phantom who took them. And a question still lingers. Did the ghost of Whitechapel ever truly disappear? Or does it still move among us, unseen, in the fog?